Hello everyone, this is Many Ninja speaking, and for today's episode we're taking a look at a clone of the SH Figuarts Batman Ninja figure from the film of the same name, which you picked up off eBay for roughly a little under half the price of what the current retail price is. For those newer to the program, we always start with an unboxing / first impressions look at the figure, followed by a look at general detail and articulation, and of course the accessories. So on here, the unboxing portion, we can already see we're going to have a little bit of trouble with this figure right out of the gate, as I literally have parts falling out of there right in the plastic shell. Namely, that's the leg that came off there, and at first it's this little mystery bit of plastic I can't quite identify. Well, I'll show you what it happened to be later. But my first initial thing before continuing with the rest of the review is trying to see how to get that leg popped back on. So after a little bit of a quick first review, we can kind of see the hip sections are kind of held in place with ball joints. And looking around the other bits, we can see the leg itself kind of operates the same way with the fighting body versions of the later Dragon Ball Z / Dragon Ball Super figures. So in theory, you should be able to just pop it right back in. But as it'll turn out in this case, I'm going to actually be struggling on camera on there, on account that the problem with this particular bit, other than a little off-fitting, is that the ball joint fit for that particular leg is actually too tight. Especially with the torso issue there, the belt there being a little too snug. So in order to get it fixed, I actually had to remove the upper bottom completely, remove the belt, and only then could I pop it in. And even then, with how tight the joint is, it's still prone to fall off. Now in order to get the figure back together, you have to put the belt back in place, which the belt is also a very stiff material, stiffer than what it should be, I imagine, which makes putting the upper torso back in place pretty difficult too. In fact, I have to fix this part off camera too, because I had to pop off the cape in order to actually accomplish that much, in order to get the figure back together. I would say the one silver lining about the matter is, once you are able to get the figure back together, it for the most part tends to hold in pretty well, as long as you're not pushing the limbs too far. Oh, speaking of that little bit of plastic I mentioned earlier, turns out it was actually a screw cover on the cape in this case. It looks like it was supposed to be held in place by glue, but the glue came entirely dried off and it just fell off during transit in this case. The cape itself is a very stiff material. Honestly, I really don't like this cape, but that's not a knock towards the bootleg as much as the original design of the figure in this case. So I can't hold this one against the bootleg directly, not counting the little screw cover. One thing I will have an issue with is I believe it's pronounced Accessory, otherwise the hip armor there, is that it's made out of, ironically, a very stiff material in this case, possibly more stiff than what the real figure has, and it actually makes the hip articulation as a whole a lot more difficult than it should be. It's actually having the upper or the lower torso there, it's getting caught on the hip armor a lot, and it really limits the articulation for the legs in general, just because I'm not getting a lot of room in order to move them, and if I move them too much, the leg will probably pop off again. It's a pity though, because when you're looking at the rest of the articulation of the figure, namely I'm looking at the knees here, they're actually very stiff, if not a little too stiff in fact, but they really hold the poses very well on there. A nice pleasant surprise concerning the last few Figuarts I've been looking at. Those hold in place. I found that the ankle joints also moved pretty well. A little bit limited if anything of the ankles, but still they really worked fairly nicely. I do have some issues which you're going to be seeing in a second with the toes. Namely, well, one of the toes and one of the feet move just fine, a little stiff or anything maybe. The other one is actually completely stuck for reasons that I'm going to make apparent in a moment. Namely, that one there, I'm completely unable to move it, and that's because of some casting issues that are having there, as well as some insertion issues of the bottom foot point. Because as it turns out, the sole of the shoe there is actually inserted incorrectly, it's disconnected. And even on top of that, there's a bit of plastic that is holding the toe locked in place, which I actually try to trim away with a little bit with an X-Acto knife later, but because of the whole sole issue, it's still not moving quite like how it's supposed to, and I'm going to have to do a little more work to fix this later down the line. Whereas you can see that one, it's properly inserted, it's going to be able to move just fine. It's a limited movement, but it does work as it's supposed to, but the other one is just completely stuck. I have to fix that one later down the line. Just to warn all of you out there, I actually did some research to see if this popped up on other reviews, and this seems to be a fairly common problem with this particular bootleg, so just beware of that. Moving on to the arms in this case, as you can see, I'm messing around with the shoulder joint. You have the full 360 range of movement, as well as a butterfly joint, which is a bit limited, but it does work, and it works fine on both shoulders, so this will not be an issue in this case. In terms of, there's actually bicep swivel that does work just fine on both cases, no issue. You do have a good elbow joint, nice stiff on there. You have a 90-degree range there. In terms of the hands, they are also on a bit of a ball joint, so you have about, it's a bit limited, but you do have a 360 range of motion technically on that one. And on the other one is the exact same thing. What I will mention though is, we can kind of see there, I'm trying to highlight, is there is a bit of paint wear or rub that's on the hands there. None of the hands have been painted perfectly, but otherwise they are functional. Looking onto the head here, we can see, curiously, it's a very glossy cowl on there, on Batman there. But otherwise, all the detail on there is as it should be. Maybe a little bit of paint wear around the mouth area itself, but everything on there moves as it should be. The eye decals are perfectly in place, which is a nice surprise. And both the neck and the head do rotate pretty well. That little spawn on the back there, it seems to be for like a ball peg or a stand peg of some sort that actually pops out a little easy. And in terms of the legs we're looking at here, they're a little glossy on the pants, surprisingly enough, but that seems to be proper for the figure. And yeah, otherwise, presentation-wise, aside from a little bit of paint issues here and there, namely around the gold bits, sometimes there's a little bit of excess paint on the side, the figure itself looks pretty solid from a general standpoint. And just for a point of demonstration, this figure can actually stand on its own, which is a really nice change of pace from what I've had as of late. So that's always a pleasant surprise. Now, moving on to the accessory in this case, Batman Ninja comes with a sword and scabbard in this case. The sword is a bit on the rubbery side, which, concerning how it's supposed to go in the scabbard later, or tsuba, however you want to call it, it does work just fine. A small note, the decal on the handle there, it's not perfect. It's a little off kilter, but still, it looks like a fairly decent representation. And as I'm about to demonstrate, yes, it does fit in the tsuba there, nice and fine. It's a perfectly good fit. There's a little bit of, on the scabbard there, it's a little bit of casting issues here and there, and there is a bit of paint issues on there, but otherwise it's not too bad. We have a bit of a angry yelling face in this case. In terms of the detailing, it works just fine, but I'm not sure if I left the footage in this particular cut of the video. Unfortunately, the ball peg on the bottom is a bit on the snug side. In fact, if you want to swap the heads, I would have to strongly recommend you heat that head up or the ball peg up in order to make it fit, because it won't fit normally otherwise. Moving on to the hands in this case, once again, just proof of demonstration. While they seem to be mostly well casted on here, these are kind of open hands that seem to be pretty good for holding the scabbard in place. They're absolutely functional. The hands are perfectly fine, except for the little bit of paint issues, which I mentioned earlier, that are actually going to be an issue throughout the whole run, unfortunately. These ones are kind of more standard ninja poses. I kind of messed around with to see if you can fit stuff in them. You technically can, but that's not what those hands are meant for. Moving onward, we see the little thing I forgot on the side there, the kunai, the throwing knives with the little bat symbol on top. They're perfectly serviceable. And as you can see, they fit in the hands just fine, although in this case, I actually put it upside down compared to what they have in the production photos of this thing. But just show of concept, they do fit. A little hard to put in and out, but they fit just fine. And also proof of concept, we're getting this sword back out in this case. Just to demonstrate. You have to kind of wiggle it in there in order to get in the hands, but yes, they will work just fine here too. And you can, technically the work, get both of the hands to actually fit in there and fit on the handle just fine. Although getting the figure arms to bend around to fit it is a little more of a troublesome bit, just to mention. Oh, and I imagine after looking at it, this is probably the hand that is supposed to be holding the scabbard in this case. So proof of concept, that works too. Very important to have, because otherwise you don't have a place to put the handles. In fact, the kunai, unless he's holding them, they don't have a proper place either. You know, another thing just to show a showcase here. Here's me trying to change the hands out. It's actually a very snug fit, I find. In fact, a bit too snug. Even though I think I took on one of the pegs on a little bit of footage I'll actually demonstrate here. The pegs are made out of a really nice solid bit of plastic, but it's just the opening on the hands are all a bit too tight. You really have to push them in there. I was kind of worried that I might actually damage the pegs in some of the cases, but thankfully enough the pegs did hold on pretty well for the most part. And the reason I say the most part is, well, this hand, you really see me kind of really struggling to push it in. When I popped off the hand off the other hand, the peg did separate at the middle there, as they are wont to do for some bootlegs like this, but thankfully it separated but didn't break fully, so I was able to push it back together and the peg is still working just fine. I just have to be very careful when switching out that particular hand. Here's showing it's kind of just popped off on half. Thankfully, it was a very clean pop off in this case, so it's not too bad to fit. Well, fit it back together and then use a thing for later here. Although I don't tend to switch this hand out too much just because I know this is an issue. It might not be an issue in your version of it, you decide to pick one up, but just to warn you, this is a thing that could happen. One thing I will mention though, when I was trying to put the cape back on, the cape is actually, well, as I said earlier, it's outright awful on this thing. There's very little room in order to kind of really fit the head and back on the peg with the cape in place, so you have to really mess around with it in order to get the cape back on. And quite frankly, a lot of the production photos seem to show this thing without the cape in place, and I could kind of understand why. The cape is honestly not adding too much of an issue or too much of a value here, but in this case, it's not so much an issue with the bootleg as much as the original production of this figure itself, so I'm not going to hold this one against the bootleg. But yeah, the cape sucks. Generally speaking, when you compare this to the original figure there, it's not a half bad take. It does have some issues here and there that the original one doesn't have, namely the whole belt issue and hips issue being a little too snug in my case. But otherwise, presentation-wise, it's got a lot of the same finishing details that the original figure has, minus some little nitpicks with the pink we have here and there. I really wish that the hands and the head fit a lot better than they did, not to mention the whole cape thing, but that's an original figure problem too. But all in all, for something that's a little under half price, you could do certainly worse than this. And, well, thanks for watching up to this point. That's all I nearly have to say on this particular figure. So we'll definitely be coming back later to try and fix some stuff with the toes there, with a couple of other things. But that's for another time. Thanks for watching. Catch you all later.